When Castlevania 64 landed on the Nintendo 64, it's fair to say that it felt that the universally accepted opinion was that it was a fun but seriously flawed game. It had major problems with its graphics, gameplay, and most importantly the controls, which were quite frankly frustrating beyond belief. Castlevania fans were quick to dodge this one, and when compared to the PlayStation's Castlevania Symphony of the Night, you couldn't help but feel that as an N64 owner, you had received the raw end of the deal. So when less than a year later Castlevania Legacy of Darkness was released on Nintendo 64, it didn't quite have the same hype around it from the gaming press. Was it just a fixed version of Castlevania 64? Was this a quick remaster? Or was this an expansion or straight up sequel? The answer is actually a little bit of everything. With additional time to work on the project, it seems that Konami were really wanting to deliver their final Castlevania work on Nintendo 64 to appease everyone who felt that Castlevania had flopped in its attempted jump into 3D. One thing to perhaps note, however, is that Legacy of Darkness is actually the Castlevania 64 that was promised pretty much from the beginning. Whilst Castlevania 64 was in development, it was always built to have multiple playable characters, and it promised an overall story arc where each of the playable characters would have their own route through the game but would intertwine to create parts of a larger narrative story. Now of course plans don't always come to fruition, and due to the development constraints, the scope of Castlevania 64 was cut and scaled back in order to hit the planned release date. These cuts dramatically changed the final game which was released. After seeing the game get mediocre reviews, Konami quickly realised their cardinal sins and announced Castlevania 64 Special Edition, essentially giving the team an additional year to work on the game to put back in everything which had been cut. Castlevania 64 Special Edition was later changed to Castlevania Legacy of Darkness, a name which I think is much more fitting, as this is much more than a tweaked Castlevania 64. But this in its own creates a whole new set of problems. For anyone who purchased Castlevania 64 and had completed both character campaigns, there needed to be enough new content for them to justify spending another $60 on this new game. For anyone who didn't purchase Castlevania 64, this new game needed to fix many of the problems the game was widely known for, and also offer some much needed graphical boosts to stop it looking very much like a first gen N64 release. This time around you have 4 characters to play as, but interestingly you are forced into playing the 2 new character campaigns first, which I think was a wise decision from Konami. Starting the game as Cornell, the half man half beast werewolf looking character, you're instantly put into a compelling, if somewhat predictable, rescue type storyline where you're on a mission to free your sister from the evil which has taken her. From the introductory cutscene including some decent quality voice acting, Cornell really is the star of the game this time around. One of the coolest things to see in previews of the game was Cornell's ability to shift between man and werewolf, which on paper sounds awesome. The sad reality is though, is that this is yet another underbaked feature, and one which really could have opened up so many more gameplay options than it ever does in the game. The simple truth is that you don't actually ever need to transform into the beast to complete the game. There are no specific stages or storyline elements which require this transformation, and gameplay wise you'd be hard pushed to see any major differences between the 2 parts of the same character. What would have been fantastic here would have been to have both elements of the character play completely differently. For example, when playing as the beast, to have significantly higher damage output or special abilities needed for certain levels. The most obvious improvement in my opinion would have been to have the beast be able to have a different style jump. Perhaps a longer jump distance to get across tricky ledges, or a much higher jump, enticing you to explore more and find hidden areas only accessible with the beast's higher leaps. Instead, aside from the novelty value, there really is little reason to ever activate beast mode here. It's also interesting that many of the characters you cross paths with on his quest mention Cornell's beast abilities and his past, but regardless of which form you enter to trigger the cutscenes with, they do not change what they say to him. Again, it could have been an awesome opportunity to have had characters react in different ways to whichever form you enter, and possibly alter the game's path, again adding some much needed replayability. As you traverse the game's levels, it's a bit of a pick and mix of old levels and some new ones. Some of the ones from Castlevania 64 have been carried over, but thankfully there are some new levels which add some nice variety into the game. Once you complete the game's campaign with Cornell, you do unlock Henry, another of the game's new characters. This time around the gameplay does change dramatically. Henry's storyline focuses on a mission he's been given to rescue children within a 7-day time period of the in-game clock. I absolutely love this mode, and for someone who gets anxiety from seeing a clock in your game time slowly ticking down constantly, that's a big compliment. Henry as a character is very wooden, and you get next to no story or character growth during his very short campaign, but at what it lacks in Shakespeare it makes up for in action. Whereas Cornell's campaign is very story driven, Henry's is an out and out action campaign, and to help you on your way you're given access to his pistol from the get-go, which easily has to be one of the most OP weapons in the history of the series. Most enemies do take a single shot of the pistol to take them down, and this frees you up as you can frantically run through the stages blasting everything you see in sight, with the sole aim of finding the children and then hitting the exit point. Like Cornell's campaign, Henry's has its own unique stages, and so some of the more platform-based levels have been swapped out in exchange for ones which allow you much more of a speedrunning feel to them. The direct contrast between Cornell and Henry really helps set the game apart, but the biggest praise of Henry's campaign is also its biggest flaw: it's just too damn short. The first time that I played Henry's campaign, I completed it within the time limit, rescuing all of the children and unlocking the final two characters making a return, who are Carrie and Reinhardt. From start to finish it took me just over an hour, and whilst it was a refreshing change from the slower adventure pace of Cornell, it really lacks any reason to replay it. As the children are located in the same positions each time during Henry's campaign, once you've found them and you understand how to solve the fairly basic puzzles, then it's a rinse and repeat any other time you play. Aside from trying to do the campaign for fewer and fewer days of the in-game clock, there's really no reason to continue replaying it over and over again, aside from unlocking costumes which are purely cosmetic. So half of the game there are two new campaigns, but then when you come to the second half of the game, it is essentially Castlevania 64, with a few tweaks here and there. For anyone who purchased Castlevania 64, there's not much of a reason to replay those two campaigns. So what you have essentially gotten here is one new playable character and a very short but great fun speed mode with Henry. However, I like to think of it as almost as if Castlevania 64 had never existed. It was released too early, and if anything it hindered Legacy of Darkness, or should almost be considered like an extended demo. The campaigns of Reinhardt and Carrie are actually really fun, and whilst they do have the same flaws they had in Castlevania 64, the overall package deal you're getting here with Legacy of Darkness really is great value for money. It's in the game's graphics, however, where things are a bit of a letdown once again. Castlevania 64 was known for its very first gen N64 release visuals, with tons of fogging and texture work which really didn't live up to expectations. This time around I will note that some of the textures were improved very slightly, but for most casual gamers you're not really going to see a night and day difference here if you looked at both titles. A big selling point was the inclusion of the expansion pack, but this being a Konami game, they were renowned for not being able to put the expansion pack compatible games into much success, and sadly Castlevania Legacy of Darkness is another title to add to the list. In short, the game is pretty much unplayable with the high-res mode turned on. From the footage you've been watching, I recorded the Cornell campaign in normal res and the Henry campaign in high res, and as you can see the frame rate is absolutely shocking here. Even without enemies on screen, and in some of the more basic environments, the game crawls along. Then you throw in a handful of enemies, or dare I say a boss battle on the screen, and you're looking at single-digit frame rates here. It's really not good. This is further compounded by some of the many platforming sequences in every campaign, where pixel-perfect jumps are often required. Trying to time some of these jumps in high-res mode will leave you tearing your hair out as you miss landings time and time again, or have repeat deaths because your movement controls are so out of sync with what you're seeing on screen. Just take my advice on this one and just stick to the normal res mode for a much more playable experience. With that taken care of though, I do want to praise the game's atmosphere. Like Castlevania 64, the game may not be a great looker, but what it lacks in detail it sure makes up for in creating a foreboding and macabre atmosphere, and it sits perfectly within that Castlevania style that you'd expect. No matter which campaign you play, you'll be greeted with a wide range of environments, from your expected castle settings to mystical and eerie chambers. Maze-like temples will greet you, and trap-filled dungeons will be waiting to test every reflex you have. The fog, which the N64 is known for, actually helps certain levels in the game create a sense of tension, as you wait to get closer and reveal what the fog has been hiding. Be it a tricky platforming section or a horde of monsters waiting to do battle, it really does feel like a classic Castlevania experience which cannot be denied. Most notably, the classic Castlevania feel is highlighted most when it comes to the game's many bosses and sub-bosses. The wide selection of these is actually something that you'll really look forward to when playing, and although some make a return across the 4 campaigns, there is some repetition there. There are enough unique ones for each character to make you want to play through all 4 campaigns to see what you come up against. The bosses have clearly had a lot of thought and focus and attention put into them, as they appear to be far more detailed and larger than life compared to the other enemies that you come across. And while some are incredibly easy, there are others that will cause you some genuine challenge, at least the first few times that you play them. They help to keep the game ticking along, but at times there are real big pacing issues with the campaigns. Henry's campaign aside, the remaining 3 campaigns are blighted by certain levels in their routes through the game, which can bring the adventure to a standstill. For the most part, the levels will either be very action based or very platform based. That's not a bad thing, but take for instance in Cornell's campaign, which sets off on a fairly rapid pace, but then around a third of the way through things slow down to a crawl when you enter the villa, and have a series of cryptic fetch and find style submissions which seems to hit you from nowhere. Then as soon as you pass that, you're back into a series of rapid fire levels with lots of action, before then hitting the Tower of Ruins, where an elaborate set of traps slows you down once again. It's also worth pointing out that some of the levels selected for each campaign don't really fit in with the storyline, and some of them seem way out of place. One moment you can go from playing in the fantastic Tower of Execution to then being thrust into the Tower of Sorcery. They are 2 incredibly contrasting levels, both visually and from a gameplay perspective, but without any cutscene or story reason to be doing them in such an order. I appreciate that Konami could have had to reuse some levels across the 4 campaigns, but a quick cutscene, even if it was just a static screen to explain why you're going between 2 very different areas, would really have helped to flesh the plot out. The biggest elephant in the room is the game's handling and camera system. It was absolutely panned in reviews on Castlevania 64, and so many of us hoped that in Legacy of Darkness things would have seen a significant overhaul, but sadly that's not the case here. Essentially you've got the exact same system, warts and all, which takes a heck of a lot to get used to. The camera happily whips itself around into awkward angles without any notice whatsoever, and often at the worst possible times. It will cause you to miss jumps, not see enemies attacking you, and try just to lock onto certain enemies or camera locations for easy navigation is a real chore here. That's not to say it's impossible to play as, and in fact quite the opposite. Once you get your head around how awkward it is, you can actually start to anticipate the nuances of it. The platforming mechanics are surprisingly forgiving, and you'll auto grab onto ledges that sometimes you'll not even expect. Now don't get me wrong, you are going to die, and die many times due to the camera, but the game's fairly forgiving in terms of the lives that you get. If you add to this being checkpoints pretty much all over each stage at multiple points, and they're usually after some of the trickier platforming sections, so once you've had a few attempts behind you, you find that you can progress through the game as long as you save regularly. If there's one thing the game cannot receive any criticism from, however, it's the game's audio department, which is absolutely fantastic. Call me biased, but it's hard to think of many Konami games on the console with bad audio. It seems that whilst they may have struggled with the technical aspects of game creation for N64, their sound team never missed a beat. Look, it's never going to be CD quality audio here, but the style and tones of the music are right on point. You get the classic eerie, haunting sounding scores blended in with such perfection that it never becomes distracting, and it complements the gameplay completely. When bosses enter, you're greeted with powerful and over-the-top pieces of music that amp up the action and make you feel like you're actually in a life or death battle of an epic scale. Then in the more platform and slower based levels, you have softer and almost mystical sounding pieces of music, which will subtly play in the background as you figure out your next move. For fans of classic Castlevania games, you'll hear modern versions of some of your favourite songs, and even subtle throwback signature tracks during key moments of the quests. The effects too are also spot on. Henry's pistol, as previously mentioned, is seriously overpowered, and it even sounds like a sawn-off shotgun being blasted, and it just works here. You get the crack of the whips, the roar of your attacks as the beast, and Carrie's magical powers all weave a perfect blend of effects which enhance the gameplay experience. Of course, the roar of the chainsaw in the maze garden will wait and greet anyone who enters it, and just hearing that sound get louder and louder as it draws closer really adds some tension into the game. So the hardest question when it comes to Legacy of Darkness is, why is the game more not fondly remembered? Well, it's not a Metroidvania style game. It fits more in with the earlier classic Castlevania style of having level progression, which you either think is the way Castlevania should be, or you prefer the much more open style progression found in Metroidvania style games. I do sit somewhere in the middle. I think there's a time and place for Metroidvania, but I tend to sway more into having a more, call it linear style level progression system these days. It's also an early 3D Castlevania game, and so let's not beat around the bush here. It is rough around the edges in pretty much all areas except for the sound. But if that was the case, then why do people still go back and love Super Mario 64? I think it's a real combination of reasons here, but for most people, and by that I mean casual players, I really think it's just an average game at best. I can't talk until I'm blue in the face about the atmosphere, the awesome storyline, and the interweaving plot, but at the end of the day, most people just wanted to pick up and play a polished title and not be frustrated by basic design flaws that detract from the experience. I can see that some publications even went as far as to give Legacy of Darkness lower scores than Castlevania 64 because they felt it was nothing more than an add-on, and I think that's a bit ridiculous personally. The simple truth is, if you have Castlevania 64 and you enjoyed it, then you're probably going to want to play this. The new characters will definitely give you some enjoyment from the game, and as you're fans already, it would hard to be disappointed by this. For anyone that didn't play Castlevania 64, then this is a no-brainer. You're getting a decent amount of challenging gameplay here all in one package, and it doesn't ever just feel like you're replaying the same game with a different character. They each have their own nuances to make you want to play it through it 4 times, but admittedly by the time you get through Reinhardt or Carrie's campaigns, then you'll have already seen pretty much all that the game has to offer. There's a reason why Legacy of Darkness is usually at least twice the price as Castlevania 64, and it's for a good reason. It's far from the best Castlevania game, but it's also definitely not the worst. There are secrets to encounter along the way, a host of weapons and challenges to work out, and some puzzle elements which the first time around will give you plenty of head-scratching moments. So I've personally always been perplexed by the constant negativity surrounding Castlevania on Nintendo 64, but what do you think? Do you think Konami made a huge mistake releasing Castlevania 64 in an unfinished state to cash in on some quick sales? Or do you think that the Legacy of Darkness is actually worth being its own unique release less than a year after the first game? I'd love to hear from anyone who's picked up Castlevania 64 and then a few months later found out that the so-called special edition was already in the works and would be released soon after. Some cool trivia for you is that Cornell's campaign is set in 1844, which is when a preacher predicted that Judgment Day would take place. This is also noted in the Japanese subtitle of the game, which refers to Apocalypse or Judgment Day. Also, the character in the game called Giles de Rey, whom you encounter at a few different points in the quest, was actually a real-life serial killer from that year, and he's associated with the legend of Bluebeard, which is why he has a slightly blue tint-coloured beard in the game. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings, comments and views down below, and so for today's topic of conversation, let me know where you think Legacy of Darkness ranks in the long history of the Castlevania series. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time.